You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you for another day this week. We were here earlier this week after a 2-week hiatus. I apologize again for that. Not a lot I could do. A lot of things happening, but we're back. We're back again before the holiday weekend. So maybe you're listening to this before the holiday weekend. Maybe you're listening to it after. Whenever you are, I appreciate it. I love doing these podcasts. I love being able to talk to you about these types of things. And, we're going to keep jumping into that. So today we're going to do a brief talk about Big 12 Media Days and maybe some of the top storylines that are going to take place this next week. Next week will be Big 12 Media Days. And then we'll continue the scheduling series with our next Utah opponent, which is going to be Arizona today. So that'll be the focus of today. But first, let me tell you about our partners at Canyon View Credit Union. Utah fans, here's a little piece of local history. Canyon View Credit Union got its start on the University of Utah campus back in 1956. And nearly 70 years later, they're still committed to helping students succeed. That's why Canyon View CU awards $15,000 in scholarships each fall and spring specifically for University of Utah students. Because college isn't just about earning a degree, it's about creating opportunities, chasing goals, and building a future. Supporting students has been a part of Canyon View CU's story since day one. Their roots run deep here, and they're proud to continue giving back to the community where it all started. To learn more about Canyon View Credit Union scholarship opportunities, visit canyonviewcu.com. Canyon View Credit Union, shaping your financial journey. All right, one little note before we jump into this. I was planning to do my last two previews next week, but with the holiday weekend and me traveling on Monday to Big 12 Media Days, it's just not going to happen. So we're going to push the last two teams of the season for Utah to after Big 12 Media Days. I'm going to be down there in Texas till Thursday, and then I'm doing a short vacation with my family out in another state that last part of that week. So next week will be Big 12 Media Days. We can pay attention on social media. I'll be getting stuff out there. My colleague Steve Bartle will be posting a bunch of podcasts out there. I may or may not be on there. Probably will not be bringing my podcasting equipment down there. There may be a chance. So you may hear from me from down there. We'll see. But if not, in 2 weeks, we will do some recap of Big 12 Media Days as well as previewing the last two teams on Utah's schedule. So we will get these done. That'll actually kind of help us get closer to the start of fall camp. But, sometimes things are out of your control. So if you're looking forward to that, if you do pay attention to these series, one, I appreciate it. And two, we'll get there. I promise you we'll get to every single team. So today's focus will be Arizona, and we'll get to that one here shortly. First, let's talk about Big 12 Media Days. As I mentioned on Tuesday, these are the four players, if you're looking on YouTube, that will be representing Utah at Big 12 Media Days. That's Devin Dampier and Wayshawn Parker on the offensive side of the ball, and then Lance Holtzclaw and Jonathan Hall on the defensive side of the ball. Four great ambassadors to the program, four guys that are going to represent the university well. And you're going to hear a lot of good things from them about culture. You're going to hear about, their visions for the upcoming seasons, why maybe people aren't respecting them well, that kind of stuff. So you're going to hear a lot of good things from them. And obviously Morgan Scalley is going to be down there as well. So July is an interesting month for programs around the country because it's kind of the 1 month that coaches get off. They don't have any responsibilities in July. So this is a big family month for coaches. And this is the one time that Morgan Scalley has to do, some stuff there. They still work, they still do things, but if there's vacations or other things that they do, this is generally that month. So, the players are gone. There's a lot more relaxation there. They're not fully into the grind yet, but they're still working, doing player run practices, that kind of stuff. So they're all really well connected, but most of them in July do go home before they report back to the school at the beginning of August to be able to start fall camp. So we'll see that. This is more of the last official capacity that they have before that begins. So looking at Big 12 Media Days storylines, we're not going to get a projected poll. After that year that Arizona State won the conference, the Big 12 has decided just to do away with it. So last year was the first year where we didn't get to see a poll. There's unofficial ones out there, right? There's a lot of people. We ranked them a couple episodes back as a KSL staff to be able to kind of get a viewpoint on that. I did a tier system. My tier 1 is obviously being Texas Tech, BYU, and Utah. Tier 2 is a whole portion of those. Arizona is actually going to be one of those teams in that tier 2 that is a fringe tier 1. So you have a lot of that stuff, but you're not going to get that natural storyline of who is the top dog. And Texas Tech is naturally going to be a top dog. BYU is going to get a lot of praise. Utah is going to get praise, but I'm curious to see how it's viewed this year in Morgan Scalley's first year. In this first year, Morgan Scalley is going to. Well, first, let me touch on some of the Big 12 things. So on Tuesday, you're going to hear from Brett Yormark. He's going to go over the high level stuff from the conference. There's going to be conversations maybe surrounded around Brendan Sorsby and gambling. I doubt it, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's at least a stance there saying that we have to protect the integrity of the sport, that kind of stuff. There's going to be a fine line walked there between the Big 12 and Texas Tech, right? They're not going to try to do anything to paint a negative light there. This is a positive environment. But at the same time, I think there's going to be conversations related around the integrity of the sport. And maybe they leave it pretty vague like that, but everybody understands that kind of situation. You'll probably get Cody Campbell here at Big 12 Media Days trying to go on his media circus and media circuit, not circuit. It is a circus, but, getting in that and doing all that. But that'll probably be the gist of that. I can't imagine there's going to be a lot of conversations. The Texas Tech media will probably have a lot more as it relates to that, and I'm sure players will have to address that and all that, but not my circus. Other situations is we'll be talking about the NCAA eligibility rules, that 5-year standard that was just set. We talked about this on Tuesday. And then obviously the biggest talking point there is going to be around playoff expansion and the Big 12's fit there. You may remember last year that there was a model put in place about 5-7, trying to create a system that allowed teams to get an equal standing there, get an auto bid. Brett Yormark was all about earning it on the field. He wants his teams to earn it on the field. And while in theory, that's a good idea, there's situations here where the Big 12 is going to be left in the dust, right? You kind of saw that last year to an extent with only Texas Tech going to the playoffs. Many thought BYU could be a good chance there. Texas Tech obviously ruined those chances for BYU, or you could argue BYU ruined, however you want to paint that picture. Regardless, there's going to be conversations about how the Big 12 fits into that model. And the growing sentiment is it'll be a 24-team model. And where does the Big 12 fit in there? How do they get their teams in there? Are there guaranteed teams in there? Those are the conversations that I think we're going to have around Brett Yormark and what his direction is. There's probably going to be conversations about money. The conference did sign it's not a PE deal necessarily, but it is a capital deal that allows schools to be able to take essentially a loan. Many of the schools aren't doing that, but there could be more conversations related to money, especially with how it relates to Utah and taking private equity. I'm sure there's going to be conversations had. Maybe Yormark has to address them or Utah will have to address them. At the end of the day, Morgan Scalley doesn't really have to answer a lot of those conversations. That's going to be more from Mark Harlan if he decides to show up this year. Those will be those conversations. So that's from the Big 12 standpoint, right? Who's going to be the top? Is it still an emphasis on trying to get some of the top teams in there? There's going to be a lot of conversation about parity still, but Brett Yormark admitted last year that there needed to be some teams that separate, and it can't be so much parity. You have to have the top dogs of the conference. Texas Tech believes that they're that team. BYU probably believes that team. Utah's getting there. They believe that they're that team. It's just going to depend on how, the chips fall this year, right? And the investments that are going to take place and that kind of stuff. So focusing on Utah, the storylines that I've picked out, there's plenty of storylines and there's going to be many out there that I forget or don't think about. There's just so many out there that you can go to. Most of what you're going to hear is going to be positive, right? Everything is going to be positive about this. Big 12 Media Days, everybody is undefeated. Everybody is, has done the work that they needed to in the off season to improve, that kind of stuff. You're going to hear a lot of that stuff. I don't think you're going to hear a coach come into that and say, you know what, we didn't hit our marks. We were really, really terrible in spring. We're not really progressing in the off season. Like that would be wild. I'd be really fascinated if there was a team that did that. But at the same time, you're going to get a positive spin on every program out there, Utah included. But with that, Morgan Scalley is going to take a lot of questions, in my estimation, about the transition from Kyle Whittingham. Not the transition itself, but just can he be the team or the head coach that can lead the team into the future, right? You've got a coach that has been here for 20 plus years. He leaves, obviously had a ton of respect and adoration around the country. There was a lot of built-in belief system that Utah was just going to be good because of Kyle Whittingham. How much of that carries over to Morgan Scalley? Obviously, he's been on the staff. He's been around Utah his entire life. But what does that lead to in terms of him being a head coach? So I'm really fascinated about the conversations that are had there. What kind of questions are being asked? How does he address them? I know from Scalley's point of view, he wants to move on, right? It's not that he's trying to move on from Kyle Whittingham. He wants to move on for his team, right? He wants to move on to be able to show the direction of the team. It's not Kyle's team anymore. It's Morgan's team. And he wants to be able to move in that direction. So I think you're going to see a lot of positioning that way. If there are questionings where, he's had his time to address that, it's going to be a time to be able to talk about, his future and moving forward. So we'll see. I'm really fascinated to see how he and Utah are perceived in his first season. It's his first season as a head coach. And just because you've been around a program forever doesn't mean that you're going to be a guaranteed successor, right? It's tough to be the man that follows the man. And he recognizes that. He even said that in his introductory press conference, that it's tough, right? But I think the way that he's going to approach this at Big 12 Media Days will be a good telltale of how he's focusing on the future and how he's rallying his team to be able to get there. So there's that one. As a team that is expected to be near the top, right? We can look at the betting odds, and I'll get into that here shortly before we get into Arizona. Utah is going to be in the top 3 of betting odds, right? Any betting odds that we've seen out there, the preseason ones, Utah is in that top 3. So though we don't have a formal Big 12 media poll to be able to rank these teams, Utah is somewhere, well, let's say top 5, right? Let's give it that. They're still going to be at the top. And so what is the conversation around Utah, if any, about how teams are going to proceed there? Last year, coming into Big 12 Media Days, there was literally zero conversation about Utah from other teams unless you asked them, because Utah was trash that 2024 season, right? They just weren't good. They weren't a team that you're going to come into that 2025 season and say, yeah, that's the team that I'm looking at. Regardless of Kyle Whittingham, regardless of all those things, there was a lot of drama and off the field problems that took place where nobody's focusing on Utah. Last year kind of changed that tone a little bit. Obviously, Utah was in the mix. Outside of losing the Texas Tech and BYU games, Utah's in the mix for that Big 12 title game. And so, there's a lot of conversations that could be had there. Texas Tech is still the team to beat in a lot of respects. There's going to be a lot of focus on how teams position themselves to Texas Tech. But I'm curious to see for BYU and Utah specifically how these two teams are viewed amongst their peers, right? There's other teams here, Arizona, Houston. There's some other teams there that are on the rise. Maybe Oklahoma State, based off of the haul that they brought in and what they did. I don't think Oklahoma State's quite in that conversation, but that came to mind. You have those other teams, how do they figure into this conversation? Are teams focusing on them? What is the focus? Is Utah part of that focus? To me, that'll be a good indicator of where people's visions are. And everybody's going to turn this inward, right? They're not going to say that, oh, we're looking at Texas Tech. No, or we're looking at Utah. They're going to focus on themselves, but there's going to be conversations and talk about some of these other teams. So curious there. For Utah, there's going to be the conversation about, can they get to the playoff? As this continues to expand, Utah was close to a 14 playoff years ago. Can they get into it now when it's 12 team? Can they get into it with a 24? You hope that they can get into it for a 24, especially since they are pretty consistently a top 25 team. But what does that look like? Can they get into that playoff structure this year before it expands? That I think is going to be a good telltale sign. Morgan Scalley is not shy about saying that he believes his team can win a national championship. Maybe he doesn't believe this specific team can win a national championship, but in totality, his program can win a championship. There is still belief that this team can ultimately win the Big 12. There's nobody on that team that doesn't believe that. And I know a lot of programs feel that way, but I think some know that they're a little bit further away. This Utah team feels like they're in the mix and they can be there. So what is that conversation? How are they positioning that? Is it just the playoffs? Is it a Big 12 title? How are they going to focus on that? The biggest story out of the actual Utah team, though, is going to be the offensive line. And it's not a sexy thing to talk about. It's not something that everybody's going to sit there and want to be able to spend hours on, because not many people understand the offensive lines. But coming off of last year, where going into that, where Kyle Whittingham said that this is arguably the best offensive line he's ever coached, and it's probably true. He had two guys that were drafted in the first round. You have that juxtaposed with this year, where you're coming in with no starters, or at least returning starters, I should say. That's a major shift in conversation, right? Going from the best to now having to replace the best. How does that gel? We saw in spring this was a unit that was growing, that was developing. They were pretty solid. But what is that conversation going to be like about around the offensive line? Have they made the necessary steps? Are they ready yet? Have they gelled? Do we know anything yet, especially from a Big 12 media days? I don't know that Devin Dampier or Wayshawn Parker are going to say anything contrary to that, especially since they haven't been able to work with them since spring. And part of that is you're not going true live, right? Devin Dampier wasn't back there fending for his life. He wasn't getting truly sacked. He was getting touch sacked, those types of things. That's a different environment when people know that they can go full tilt and come after your quarterback. Can the offensive line hold up to that? That's going to be a major storyline to me, and for Big 12 media days and for the entire season. I don't know that you're going to get a ton from that, because it's not a sexy thing that you can talk about. Nobody really cares about the offensive line unless it sucks, right? And even last year with Spencer Fano and Caleb Lomu, there was conversations there. It helped that, they were there at Big 12 media days and you could talk to them. But at the same time, or at least Spencer was, it helps that they were there, but it's not one of those things that you're going to get a ton of conversations around. So there's that. Another one that I have on mind, Devin Dampier's focus going into the season, right? Obviously, last year he felt like he was a great player, top player in the Big 12, but he wasn't quite to the level that he needed to. What has he done to change in the offseason to get him to that next level, right? He spent a ton of time in Arizona with the wide receivers on his own body. He's had surgery. He's done a lot of the things to be able to help him to be in the best position possible to succeed this year. What does that look like for Devin Dampier? And I'm really fascinated to hear the conversations around him and what his focus is. Next, maybe it's just managing roster turnover, right? There was a ton of roster turnover. And how does Utah gel with that? Bringing in a ton of people from the transfer portal while still infusing that with the people that were already in the program that are stepping up now. I don't think that's a huge one, but it's still something. Next one, something that I'm personally fascinated by, is Lance Holtzclaw testifying at Congress. I'm sure there's going to be conversations around that, if not just for me alone. I'm really fascinated about how that all came about and what took place there to be able to allow him to testify before Congress, and why he's leading the charge, and then pivoting that to how that translates to him leading a team, right? He has been the vocal individual on the defensive side who has probably been the biggest advocate for that defense and helping them get to the level that they need to. He's done that now as a whole student athlete body, right? For the entirety of college. How can he do that for his team? And lastly, I don't know if there will be any conversations about this. I'm sure somebody will ask it. But there's obviously been a lot of chatter online, especially Twitter, about Utah going to the Big Ten. There's been some national reporters who are following this stuff. What conversations around that? Nothing is imminent, right? Like I want to tell you right now, nothing is imminent. A lot of this is just the regular summer conversations that are being had. But is there any conversations about that? None of these players or even Morgan Scalley are going to necessarily address it. But are people wondering, about Utah? Are they wondering if Utah is still a fit in the Big 12? Meaning, are they going to stay? We'll see. These are the conversations that I think could be had. I really don't think that one's going to have a ton of merit, but it's one that is continually present in this landscape, and it's one where Utah's obviously been building towards bigger deals and bigger opportunities, whether that's through its college town magic and building out campus and trying to grow, securing a PE deal that could provide funding for the university to help them get to that next level. All of these things are quote unquote steps to get to a higher level, whether it's the Big Ten, whether it's this new iteration of what the Power Two structure is. whatever it may be, I think Utah is on their way there. And there's a lot of programs that are in that same spot. Texas Tech isn't shy about wanting to get there. There's a lot of programs that want to get to that next level, as you should. Your competitors do want to get there. But how this relates, I think it's more related to the PE deal. Is there going to be conversations to the PE deal and the next step of why this was taken to be able to get there? What conversations will be had about the PE deal in general? I don't know. We'll see. So that, to me, those are probably some of the top storylines. Maybe some of them are less than others. I've probably missed big ones that you're thinking, like, why didn't he think about that? Like I said, there's so many out there to talk about. At the end of the day, it's up to us as media asking the questions. It's up to the players addressing certain things, and we'll see what happens. So, we'll get into that. Let's jump into Arizona. I know nobody really cares about what could happen next week. I don't. I'm ready to just go there. I'm ready to go get some good barbecue food. That's really my focus, quite honestly. Go get that Texas Twinkie. That's phenomenal. I need that in that bloodstream of mine. All right, let's talk Arizona. Before we do this, I always put this out there, the Big 12 odds from Bovada. This was the preseason ones. This is the win totals for the teams. So if you're looking at YouTube, you can see all of this, or any other video platform that I have on this. I keep saying YouTube because that's whatever. On video. If you're watching on video. Texas Tech, obviously number 1, 10.5 wins. BYU and Utah at 8.5. The team that we're talking about today is Arizona, and they're in a lump of 3 other teams that are 7.5 wins. So you've got Arizona, Houston, and Kansas State, all your tier 2, quote unquote, tier 2 teams that are going to be there. All 3 of these teams can be in the mix of winning a Big 12 title. They may just have different situations that maybe aren't as advantageous as the top 3 teams, we'll say. But that line that is razor thin, right? Like, I think there's not a lot of separation between, let's say, BYU and Utah and Arizona, Houston, and Kansas State. I think the way that this conference is, one game could turn the entire thing there. And so if BYU or Utah, for example, lose the wrong game, one of those other teams could step up. Assuming that Texas Tech just continues to roll. Their schedule is pretty soft this year. That's not to say that there aren't traps. We obviously don't know what the quarterback situation is going to look like, but at the same time, it's probably Texas Tech, barring something changing, and then the rest is playing for second place, right, or somewhere in that mix. Not to say that none of those teams can't beat Texas Tech in the Big 12 title game, but I think that's just kind of the situation right now until it's proven otherwise. So that's Arizona. Let's look at Arizona. Arizona, this is game 10, right? And this is an away game for Utah. It's going to be a challenging game, and a game that I think, obviously, if Utah's in position to be able to get to the Big 12 title game and they're doing well, this game could have different standing, right? But if you're just looking from a scheduling standpoint, pretend that this isn't, you're just kind of throwing teams out there of games that you could potentially lose. This is a game that Utah could lose. I'm not saying they will lose, but this is a game they potentially could lose. It's on the road. It's a week after the rivalry game at BYU, and the emotional high that comes from that rivalry game is tough. You've got a situation where, let's say you even beat BYU. The emotional high of that, you've got to now come down and say, okay, look, we still have to face the top team, but now there's those emotions like where you kind of take things off a little bit, because if you got that win and you broke the streak and yada, 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 there's some like relief there, right? And maybe not for every player. Not every player's been on that roster and understands it, but there's a lot of conversations about that you don't lose to that team. So now you get that emotional high and kind of dropping down to that, and now you have to travel. That becomes a challenge, right? Especially in a pivotal game against Arizona, where this absolutely could matter for Big 12, seedings, right? If Utah, like I said, is in contention, I think the focus remains, right? We'll see how this team stays together and it gels. There's a lot of conversations about building the culture, building kind of that team camaraderie. We've seen it in spring. This is a close-knit team, and a lot of that you saw last year is building into this year. Maybe even better. I don't know. We'll see. So this game is a very interesting game, especially coming off of the BYU game and then Arizona. These are 2 back-to-back games, which are going to be pivotal to Utah's success in the Big 12. You lose both of these, you lose one of them, it could be detrimental to your chances of getting into the Big 12 title game, despite maybe any of the other successes that you had in the season. We'll see. I don't want to put too much on this game, but I think this is one of the only games outside of BYU this year where it's going to be tough. Now, Houston is tough. Don't get me wrong. You get that at home. You do have a wonky game to Cincinnati that could be a challenge. Many of these can be, especially if Utah's not gelling well, the offensive line isn't doing well. But Arizona is the game that I think that you have to circle outside of BYU, where you have to have your full focus, right? You have to have the full focus every week. And you hear the players talking all the time, this is our Super Bowl every single week. Whatever you want to call it, it just has to be your focus, right? And I think Arizona is going to be a focus. Arizona doesn't have an easy game, schedule coming into this either. They have to go to Texas Tech, and then the week before they're at home against TCU on a Friday night. Friday night games are weird. And if Arizona's doing well and TCU, is a good team this year, maybe Arizona limps into this game after a loss. I don't know. Maybe they come off of a win. Maybe they beat Texas Tech, and there's emotional things there as well. But this isn't going to be easy for them coming into this game as well. TCU is that next tier after them, but many see them as potentially being in that same tier as Arizona, a team that can compete for a Big 12 title. Those are two tough games that you have to play. And now you get Utah, assuming that Utah is solid and a competitor for the Big 12 title. That's three teams that are essentially in the mix for a Big 12 title that you have to go through and hope that you can continue. And we'll get into kind of some of the nuances with this Arizona team that may make it a challenge, but not easy for either one of these teams. And you can argue who has the tougher situation. Arizona obviously is at home, so that helps. If the season is rolling and Brent Brennan has this team going, that stadium is going to be pretty crazy. We've been to games where Arizona is dead. There's been games where we've been there and it's raucous, and Utah leaves there just feeling like terrible. So to that point, the last time that Utah was there or played Arizona was in 2024. Utah's terrible season. They lose 23-10. Just doesn't go well, right? I mean, this has not been a great situation for Utah, that 2024 season, just hoping that it ended, and it almost needed to end at that moment. This was, if I'm not mistaken, a home game, and you just don't lose many games at Rice Eccles Stadium, especially that early in the season, and just not a great situation for Utah. Arizona is on a 2-game winning streak. Both of them have been somewhat blowouts, at least I should say by more than 2 scores. After that, Utah had 6-game winning streak, and it wasn't particularly close many of the years. There were times that there were, but for the most part, Utah dominated Arizona and then suddenly lost that and had two losing seasons against Arizona. So didn't play them last year, but now you get an opportunity to come back. Had that 2024 team wasn't even a good Arizona team per se. If you had lost to last year's Arizona team, I think there would have been a little bit more people would have been okay with it. But the 2024 season, losing that game, not a great situation. And honestly, that season was not great anyway. So this Arizona team, though, has improved a ton. So last year, this is Brett Brennan's second season, came from San Jose State. The first season just kind of still wasn't there. Really kind of changed a little bit of Noah Fafita, and Utah fans have known Noah Fafita really well from his time beginning in the Pac-12, where his freshman season especially, he looked like he was going to be a Heisman contender for years to come. And then it just kind of bottomed out. He didn't really succeed. Brent Brennan last year got him to do, or 2 years ago got him to do stuff, but it still wasn't the same Noah Fafita that we all knew. And then last year he returned to a lot of his strengths, but he's developed much more into a passer. Last year, let me see if I've got the stat right here. Last year, he only rushed for 216 yards and had 3 rushing touchdowns. He's become much more of a passer in what he's been able to do, and that's allowed him to be able to be successful. And I'll get into the offensive scheme here shortly and why he's been able to be successful with that. Either way, he's found a way to unlock Noah Fafita and be successful with him. And that's really dangerous for a lot of teams because Fafita is an experienced quarterback. He's been around the block for years. He understands what he needs to do. And if you can continue to have him under center, that becomes a real challenge for Utah for many reasons. And I'll get into that. Sorry, I've got something itching my eye. If you're watching on video, I keep touching my face and I apologize. I think I had a hair in my eye or something. My apologies. All right. Another thing about last year is this defense last year was really phenomenal, and they were really aggressive, especially in trying to pursue turnovers. They had 22 interceptions last year and 31 turnovers. That 22 interceptions actually was second in the country of number of turnover or interceptions. This was a team that pursued the ball. They were ball hawkers. They did incredibly well and were able to make big impacts in the game because of that. And I think Fafita was good and they had a lot of success, but at the same time, the defense is what really helped Arizona win games. And that was a big point for them. They did lose to, if I'm not mistaken, BYU and Houston. Then they went on a 4-game winning streak in November to finish strong. This was a team that was positioned to be able to get there. They just unfortunately lost some of the wrong games, right? You lost to Houston and BYU, two teams that were in the mix for a Big 12 title that just kind of pushed them out of that tiebreaker scenario. BYU obviously didn't lose again, but had they lost again, Arizona still would have kind of been under that because of the wrong teams that they lost to. So really, really solid team. Unfortunately, a lot of the core of that team, or at least maybe not a lot of the core, but a good portion of the core of that team either went to the NFL or graduated. That's not to say that this team is all young now, right? There's still a lot of those core pieces there, and we'll get into the roster here shortly. But for the most part, a lot of those key pieces, especially in the secondary, are gone. And so there's a little bit of a youth movement, right, where you're trying to build some of the depth and trying to build some of the pieces there. But a lot of what made Arizona successful last year has left. You still have Noah Fafita, and that's going to be your biggest selling point. But for the most part, you don't have the defensive side, that secondary that's going to be able to help that. So we'll see how that changes. That's going to be a big storyline for this year. Coming off of last year, there was no coaching changes. Brett Brennan wanted to keep consistency and stability with his coaching staff. It obviously was working well, and so there's no reason to shake things up. So with that, you have your offensive coordinator and your defensive coordinator returning. Seth Doge, I'm probably mistaking his name. I don't know. I forgot to look up a pronunciation out of it. We'll just go with the Dogecoin. How about that? We'll say that that's his last name. He was a former quarterback at Texas Tech under Mike Leach. And so that alone right there should ring some bells. Hey, he's probably pretty air raid heavy, right? He wants to go with the pass. He's worked with Lincoln Riley. He's worked with Lane Kiffin. They're all under that same tree of, trying to have an air raid, the high tempo, that kind of stuff. And so a lot of his concepts are going to be focused primarily around the pass, but he's not solely like that true air raid system. He does love his up tempo. He does want a no huddle system. He wants to push them to quote extreme limits, this being the defense, to be able to make them work. They do a really good job here of being able to utilize the in communication systems in the helmet. So Noah Fafita has pretty much constant conversation with his offensive coordinator because that time cuts off or the microphone shuts off at 15 seconds left in the play clock, but they are able to run plays so fast that you're basically constantly telling your quarterback what they need to do. You can look at the reads of what the defense is doing in their shell system or whatever they have, and that puts a ton of stress on the defense to try to move. They've been very effective with that because they can get up, line up really quickly, and do what they need to. So there is still a lot of the same concepts of a spread air raid type system where you're spreading out that field, right? You have tons of spacing between your wide receivers, your running backs, your tight ends, everything there to force the defense to basically spread out and cause problems. This is not new concepts per se. This is stuff that teams have seen, but if the defense isn't executing it well, it becomes a challenge, and that's what makes these air raid offenses so successful is because you have to manage so many different things. And with them doing it fast, you have to be on your P's and Q's or else you're in a world of hurt. And so, like I said, a lot of tempo, no huddle system. You're pushing to the extremes. There's a lot of spacing there. There's a lot of screen variants to be able to make it so, there's the bubble screens. You've got the pick plays. You've got a lot of those different things to try to make it work to get the players the ball. And as part of that, Noah Fafita is going to move quickly as well. He's going to try to get that ball out quickly to be able to make sure that he can get what he needs to. There's not going to be a ton of, stepping back and waiting a couple seconds and going deep. There will be some of that, as every system does. but there's going to be a lot of short to intermediate passes, getting free off of screens, getting free off of different ways to use that spacing that'll allow them to be able to work. But within that system, most air raids, they do rely on the run, but it's not necessarily a key focal point of that. Under his system, he wants to be able to utilize a strong running game. He wants to utilize inside zone plays. He basically wants to make it so you can't just stack a whole bunch of defenders out in the backfield. You can't go like, 5 or 6 DBs back there. He wants to make sure that you're honest and make sure that he can beat you in so many facets of the game. And so that becomes a challenge because you have to do it quickly, you have to be on it, and you have to be able to cover a lot of different space and ground that normally you're not necessarily trying to do that. So that's what makes the offense successful. They can do really well with it. We'll get into some of the personnel here shortly on maybe can that work? What can they do? All that kind of stuff. Defensively, getting into that, Danny Gonzalez returns again. His defensive scheme is a base 3-3-5. But when I say a base 3-3-5, it exists, but the way that they kind of disguise it doesn't look like a 3-3-5 at times. A lot of it is very positionless. We'll say that it's positionless. So it doesn't follow a lot of set schemes per se. What he tries to do, what Gonzalez tries to do, is he tries to find just literally the best 11 players on the field. So, there may be a guy that maybe doesn't fit a specific position, but he is one of the best players on the field. And so they'll find ways for it to work. So you may have a linebacker that lines up as a D end a lot of times, or a D end that steps back into a linebacker. He has a lot of that situation. He calls it a red rover, where he'll have his base 3-3-5, and then one of those defensive linemen then shifts back, and suddenly it's a 2-4-5, right? So suddenly you have 4 linebackers, you have 5 in the secondary. There's a lot of different things that allow him to be able to be efficient with that. And so there's going to be a lot of scheming mismatches. There's going to be a lot of different things to try to create simulated pressures or to drop into coverage. If Devin Dampier is not ready and studying a lot of what they're able to do, this becomes a challenging defense just because there's just so many ways to approach it. And with this team being very aggressive in their pursuit of the ball, there's a lot of turnover opportunities, right? And that can obviously spell a lot of troubles for anybody. With Utah trying to emphasize the pass so much this season, or at least make that more of a focal point, I wouldn't at all be surprised if they change the script here and try to do a little bit more of a run game. And if they can be effective with their offensive line, maybe you relax that before taking it off the top, right? We'll see how this all works. Maybe Arizona's defense isn't as good as last year, and so it doesn't have that same ability to get to turnovers. Maybe Utah's not great as a passing team. Maybe they are. There's a lot of variables that go into this. This is game 10, right? You're at the bottom of the season. You're almost done. You're either limping to the finish or you're trying to finish strong. There's a lot of different things that can happen here. And so for me to say here in July that Utah's best attack is probably more of a ground game could be misguided. I'd say on paper right now, that's probably a little bit more effective, or at least shorter plays, different things to be able to to attack that 3-3-5. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. Either way, this is a positionless defense that can utilize a lot of players to be able to get, to create their aggressive play style. So there's that. Let's jump into the actual personnel. So I've already mentioned it. Quarterback is Noah Fifita. Everybody that is a Utah fan is very well versed in Noah Fifita. His freshman season, he was much more of a dual threat quarterback where he used his legs to absolutely dice people apart. Brett Brennan isn't utilizing him as much that way. That's not to say that he can't, but you're not seeing him do that a ton. And so you're seeing him as much more of a pocket passer and trying to be effective there in the pocket. Last year, he tossed 3,228 yards, 29 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions at a 64% completion rate. Really solid numbers for Fifita. Coming into the season, he's arguably the best quarterback in the conference, right? There's variations there, but I think just on his veteran, he's been around the block. He's thrown for a ton. He's on a winning team. I think there's a lot to kind of indicate that it's his to beat as the best quarterback. Now, Devin Dampier will have a say at that. You've got Bear Bachmeyer that would like to have a say at that. There's other quarterbacks. Drew Mestamaker would love to have a say at that. But I think Fifita is probably one of the best quarterbacks in the league. You can argue whether he's the number 1 or number 4. It doesn't matter. He's near the top. And I think his veteran leadership is going to really make the difference here for this team, assuming that he can have a similar number to last year. One second. I got to drink. All right. Sorry. Throat's dry. At running back, you've lost your leading rusher who had 859 yards last year and 4 touchdowns. A ton of yards, but not anything earth-shattering. Once again, they prioritize a portion of the run, but it's not the priority. And so there's going to be opportunities here, but it as long as it's effective, they're going to be okay, right? They still have to be effective, keep defenses honest, like I said, so you don't, stack the secondary and just take away all the passing, the drop 8 systems or whatever you want to call them. So there's going to be effective rushers. With that said, you do have 2 returning rushers in Kendrick Riscano. He's a senior. He finished with 396 yards last year and 9 touchdowns. Is really effective in touchdowns. And then Quincy Craig comes in. He's also a senior. He had 364 yards and 2 touchdowns. So both of those guys are probably going to see the ball a little bit. Riscano probably a little bit more. He's probably your number 1 back. That would be my assumption, but you're probably going to see both of these guys. Like I said, I don't know that they're going to be the focal point of the offense, but this isn't a true air raid system where you're just going, tossing the ball around, the Mike Leach system, where it's just he's absolutely gutting you that way and very limited in the run game. This will have run concepts and not just as kind of like a throwaway. This will definitely have abilities where they can utilize that, and they'll line up in ways that make you think that they're going to pass it, and then they gash you with the run. So if Utah's not solid on its defensive run game, that could be a big area of attack, because then they start gashing you that way. And then when Utah maybe potentially tries to fix that, then you throw it over the top and absolutely take the ceiling off. This is like why I said it can be a really dangerous situation. At wide receiver, they lose their top receivers to graduation. So Chris Hudson and Javin Watley, they had 1,254 yards combined. Really solid production from the 2 of them. They're gone now to graduation. With that said, though, you do return your 3rd, 4th, and 5th leading receivers. And so there's a lot of consistency there. The question just, can they take that next step, right? Trey Spivey is probably your leading candidate to be your X receiver, the top dog, your wide receiver 1, however you want to call that. He finished with 381 yards last year and 7 touchdowns, but he's expected to take a much bigger role for this team and kind of be the focal point of that offense. So, he's been around the block as well. He's a junior. The next one's a senior. Chris Hunter is a senior. Gio Richardson is a sophomore, so he's a little bit younger, but you've got guys that have had some experience and they've been there. We'll see what happens. Chris Hunter also had 372 yards. Gio had 299 yards as a freshman, so really solid play there. They're going to be in there, barring injuries or anything that way. Those are going to be kind of your guys that they focus on. At tight end, you have an Illinois transfer in Cole Rusk, who comes in as a senior. Last year, he had 217 yards and a touchdown, probably much more offensive line play, building in the trenches, but has the ability to be a pass catcher and a playmaker that way. And I have to assume that in this system, you're going to see a lot more of him as a pass catcher. So, bigger body, what does he do there? Is he a fullback? Does he act as a pass catcher? What does he do to be able to unlock different potential there for this Arizona offense? Other players that have transferred in that could be a factor, just not a ton of production, but still players that can factor into that is Jordan Ross. He's a junior from Colorado State. DJ Jordan, a redshirt freshman from USC. A lot of expectations for him and what he's able to do. And then Rodney Gallagher, the 3rd. He's a senior from West Virginia. He's the one that has the most production at 243 yards last year. Didn't have a touchdown, but still depth guys. So between those 6 or 7 players, that's probably going to be your core of the wide receivers, barring injuries or different things that way. Those will be the guys. So good pieces. I think this offense has real potential to be successful and being able to gel. They have enough holdover from last year, especially on the offensive side of the ball, to be able to make things work. It's just a matter of guys stepping up and doing it. To finish that out with the offensive line, they do lose 2 of their key, starters there on the offensive line. So 2 of your starters there do leave. They were key interior linemen to help. but you do have returning starters on the right-hand side that have a ton of snaps. So 876, 8 snaps, 628 snaps on that offensive line. They grade out fairly well on Pro Football Focus, especially Tristan Bounds. He's your right tackle, or at least he's expected to be your right tackle. He grades out fairly well, especially in pass blocking. They do bring in a transfer from Washington at center at Zachary Henning. He had 333 snaps there at Washington. Decent grades in Pro Football Focus. But that left side of the ball, you're bringing in guys that are more depth players that didn't grade out as well in Pro Football Focus, but they also weren't your star players yet. So really curious on that side of the ball how it handles. Assuming that what I'm saying today is exactly how that starting five will go. These are all projections, right? Based off of some of the research that I've done, some of the reporting that's been done in Arizona. That's kind of the expectations there. But for now, it seems like the left-hand side of that offensive line is going to be a little bit more development, in the sense that guys coming up and building up, more like Utah's side, right? Guys that have been depth pieces, they're coming up, they're trying to build into it. Whereas the right-hand side is guys that have been starters, they've had a little bit more veteran experience, that kind of stuff. So it's we'll see how this offensive line gels. Like I said, this offense has a lot of the key pieces there to be able to be successful. They've got a good line, we assume. We'll see if they can be able to maximize that to be able to help this offense go. You've got to move quickly, and if that offensive line isn't gelling well, that's the big issue of up-tempo teams, is things can spiral real quickly. So offensively, really solid team. This is what makes Arizona really dangerous. I mean, the defense does too, but this is what makes them dangerous because they're returning a lot of key pieces. That should help. On the defensive side of the ball, as I've mentioned before, they did lose 4 players to the draft from the secondary. And so you lost 2 safeties and your 2 corners. Really, really solid players that help this team have the success that they had with their 22 interceptions. You're not that successful without those 4 players, right? You're now having to build into that, trying to create another roster that can have that same aggressive play style. Assuming that the reporting is, what it is and kind of the expectations there, you do have a transfer from Wyoming and Tyrese Boss, who's coming over, who has a lot of experience there, who will fill in as a corner. You have Javion Cole, who will return as a corner as well. So you have a guy that's been in there, a little bit more depth. He does have a low NFL passer rating, though. He's a really solid player. Had 3 pass breakups, 4 interceptions last year, 2 touchdowns. So he's probably going to be your focal point there in the secondary. But Tyrese Boss has 4 pass breakups last year, a little higher NFL passer rating against him, but not bad. At safety, you're probably going to rely on 2 transfer safeties in Malcolm Hartzog Jr. from Nebraska. Didn't get a ton of snaps last year with Nebraska, but had 1 pass breakup and 1 interception. Has a very low NFL passer rating against him, 27.1, which is probably the best. I think it is the best. Let me look. Yep, the best of at least the projected starters. So limited snaps, so it's hard to know how that'll translate to more runs, but a really solid, strong safety for this team who should add to that aggressive play style. At free safety, excuse me, you're expected to see Dalen Austin, a transfer from Oregon. He had 148 snaps last year, 1 pass breakup, 1 interception. Oh, he actually has a lower NFL passer rating against him at 19.8. So your 2 safeties right there, sub 30 passer rating, which, look, you're under 50, that's incredibly solid. So if they can do that at a higher level and get a lot more snaps and work back there for Arizona, this could be another dangerous secondary for Arizona. So you've got to really make sure you're on top. Yeah, up front, your defensive line, there's guys that are coming in, more depth pieces that are going to be working into it. We'll see. 3-man front, there's good things out of them. Trey Smith is probably your highest graded defender there with a 79.0 defensive grade, 144 snaps. He had to medical redshirt last year after 4 games. So hard to know. He's one of your defensive ends. We'll see what happens there. At linebacker, your 3 expected linebackers. One is Chase Kennedy. You may remember that name. He was a former Utah player before transferring. He had 537 snaps last year, had 4 sacks, really solid NFL passer rating against him. Grades out at a 65.5 in defense on Pro Football Focus. Solid player there. Your two other guys have had a little bit more reps are Tay Brown, 752 snaps at Arizona, 7 hurries, 2 sacks, 62 tackles. Really kind of the focal point of that defense with that linebacker unit. Expect him to kind of still be there. And then they bring in a transfer from Memphis in Everett Rosal, a junior, had 777 snaps, 13 hurries, 2 sacks, 46 tackles. So you've got a really solid defense. I think the offense does have pieces that they need to build into, but I think the defense has a little bit more that they have to build up to in the front. Behind them, I think they're going to be solid, right? I think the transfers that they got, assuming that they can compete and produce at the level that they did in the limited reps that they had at the previous school, this should be a really solid group. They're going to be aggressive. They're going to, they can do well. With that said, it's tough to be able to have a 22 type interception season back to back years. It's possible, but it's very hard to do that. And sometimes those 50-50 balls go the wrong way. And instead of an interception, it turns into a long touchdown or a long play. And now Arizona is sitting there worried, right? So we'll see how these players interact, see how they work, how they gel together. I'm not quite ready to say that the defense is the same as last year, but I'm not willing to say that they're going to take that much of a hit either. I think they've got enough pieces there that they can work with. I would say that they're probably more of the question of the team right now, despite having a lot of that consistency. I think the offense has just got a little bit more built-in consistency there from last year that'll make it work. But there's enough core players from last year's team on this team on the defensive side of the ball that it should still have a lot of the same similarities there. I really think a lot of their success is going to come down to what that secondary does. If that secondary has remotely the same amount of success that they had last year, this could be another really potent, dangerous team that makes this really challenging. So, this Arizona game is going to be tough. Like I said, barring the wheels falling off this year and, maybe there's injuries or, it's not gelling the way that they need to, this becomes a really challenging team for Utah. And especially with this being late in the season, you're in that November hunt where you're trying to get into that playoff stretch. The college football playoff rankings are out. You're trying to build up there, assuming that Utah is even in that situation. This becomes a very pivotal game. And because it comes off of that BYU game, it makes it even more of a challenge. So, I personally, I'm going to chalk it up to a loss just right now, just to be able to kind of cover that basis. But it's a winnable game by all means. I think there's a lot of questions that Utah has, namely that offensive line that we talked about. But I think if Utah can be effective in what they've done this season, this is a winnable game by all means, right? This is not a game that just circle it as a loss. This isn't like one of those old Oregon USC games where you just came in and you're going to lose, right? Arizona is not unbeatable. And so I think this becomes a challenge, but it's a winnable game. So we'll see. I'm really fascinated to see how these two teams go. The beauty of it is you get it late in the season, which means you've seen a lot on tape. This isn't a game that you're going to get early. And you could argue some of the merits of playing a team like this early, but I think this is going to be a marquee game, assuming that both of these teams are solid. This could be very well primetime TV. It could be, a Fox type game. It'll probably be late at night. You'll probably get an 8:15 kick just because it's Arizona, and Arizona gets a lot of those because of the heat or whatever. It's November, so it shouldn't be as bad, but you never really know. I still think really cool opportunities to see these two teams that should be expected to compete for a Big 12 title. So, love to see it. Happy to have a lot of these fun games late in the season. I think it's going to matter, and really curious to see where it all goes from here. So that'll be our podcast today. Like I said, we will go to Big 12 Media Days next week. I will get you all that information there, as well as my colleague Steve Bartle, who will be there with us. We're going to go have a lot of fun, go get some barbecue, go talk to a lot of players, coaches, other personalities to try to get some information about Utah and continue on this run. And then we'll jump back into the podcast world the week after. So with that, we'll sign out today. Thank you so much. And I hope you all have a great holiday weekend. Stay safe. Don't do anything dangerous with fireworks. If you're in Utah, you probably can't light them off anyway because there's restrictions. Just be safe and have a great holiday weekend, and we'll catch you later.